This is Henry Sanderson, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, I've got Henry on the show. Here's a link to his book right down below down here.
Thank
It's
you.
called Alt Rush. Yeah, the winners and losers in the race to go green. And
Thank you.
I guess just a caveat up front is, I invested in Tesla, gosh, years ago. It's over 10 years ago that I did this, right? Because I'm like, yeah, I see the future in this. I understand that this is the direction we're going. But that was as sophisticated as my investment position was. I didn't know enough to know enough. And then when I was going through your book, here's another thing I know about. It's always interesting to me. As much as we want to have this green energy or renewable energy world, thermodynamics, those laws, they really govern things because they're like these scientific laws that we didn't make up. We just discovered them. And it makes it hard just on the science side to extract. I mean, look, what I've taken to calling organic or plant-based energy, like gasoline and things like that, it's so powerful. Like,
yeah,
I had an Iraqi guy tell me I could light the dirt in my yard on fire, right? That's how close to energy petroleum is. Like, potential to ignition to releasing energy. And so these things all become really complicated, and your book dives into so many aspects of it. It must have been a hell of an education for you.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting because about over 100 years ago, it is interesting because the electric car was a contender. At the time, you had steam cars, electric cars, gasoline cars, and the gasoline car took off. As you say, gasoline is very energy dense, right? You burn it, you get energy. And once they discovered the starter motor, then gasoline cars took off. But I think electric cars make a lot of sense, right? And it's unfortunately taken us a long time to make them viable again. And I think the reason is, as you say, the battery is pretty hard to get a good battery. And the lithium-ion battery, which was commercialized in 1991, right? That's a long time after the beginning of the century when electric cars were around. So it takes a long time to get good batteries. And then since 1991, until Tesla came out and others, right? It's taken all that time, and we're now we passed the tipping point, I believe now, where we're firmly going electric. And my book explores the sort of more hidden side of what does this mean, right? Because if we want to solve climate change, reduce carbon emissions, we need to do things at speed and scale, right? Massive scale, massive speed. So this involves building entirely new supply chains, right? You think of how big the fossil fuel infrastructure is around the world. It's just absolutely mammoth, refineries, tankers, coal mines, so we've got to build a whole new supply chain, and we've got to do it quick, right? So this is what my book looks at, and some of the power players, like hidden billionaires behind this.
Yeah, so as you go through the book, there's some things that you pick up. So we talked initially about the laws of thermodynamics, which make this already an incredibly challenging problem, right?
Yeah.
And then you have forecasts, like when Elon Musk talks about how many batteries and how much lithium we're going to need and everything else. So you project as a company, and you invest in this company, that company, things that have failed in the past. And then you find out, you've over projected, or the market and the demand aren't set up for what the projections were, which leads to, and I'm just making up a scenario here, but which leads to jobs being cut, companies going bankrupt, people getting upset, which leads to elections going in a different direction. And all of a sudden, all of these political and other aspects impact that market.
And I think that's one of the key things I wanted to get across, which is, I think people assumed, if you move from fossil fuels to clean energy, geopolitics would somehow disappear, and we'd all enter this world where we just have solar panels and wind turbines, and conflict is a thing of the past. But it's not like that, right? The geopolitics of clean energy are going to be quite messy, and we're already seeing signs of that. And as you say, it's going to be more volatile, right? A lot of market forces, prices going up and down. It's going to be a lot of volatility and a lot of geopolitics as well. But the good news is, at the end of the tunnel, mid-century, perhaps, we will be more energy independent as countries. Once we get once we build all of this infrastructure out, once we make the switch, then things could look a bit better.
One of the things that we look at, and we have this lament the early invention of the electric car, which, as you explore, like batteries, even in spite of a lot of really smart people, to include Edison, this wasn't quite ready. But then later on, GM has its electric car, and there's a lot of people that believed it was killed by something other than its capability. Can you talk a little bit about the starts and stops of the electric car industry prior to this era now?
Yeah, so there've been lots of attempts. Even Ford, I think back in the 1960s, had an electric car and a battery, and there's been loads of failed attempts. And I think each time, what's interesting, reading back at them, each time they say, this time is it, right? This time is going to make the difference. And you're right, GM had this EV1 that actually a lot of people liked, right? It had a lot of loyal followers from in the late 90s, and then they decided to kill it. And there's this famous documentary, Who Killed the electric vehicle, right? And they everyone came out to mourn the loss of this vehicle, and it's a real pity. And I remember, early 2000s, everyone wasn't talking about batteries; they're talking about fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen powered vehicles. So the EVs really had a long, hard road to success. And I think the genius of Tesla was making a desirable vehicle that was premium, that was luxury, that was cool, right? It wasn't sort of it didn't have drawbacks, or it wasn't targeted at small, like eco types, right? It was kind of sexy, premium. You can have a car that did a lot of things, right? And I think that was a clever strategy, right? Starting at the premium end. And I think now the issue we have is we've got to move electric vehicles from premium to mass market. This is something that's happened in China, but we need to make that leap in the US to make cheaper electric vehicles, right? And this all requires, as I talk about in the book, batteries and raw materials. So this is our key next step, right? Making EVs. I don't know how it is where you are. In London, there's loads of EVs now, but it's still very much a premium market, right? It's coming down a bit, but yeah, the US market we need to see that happen.
It's interesting. So I get to travel across the nation quite a bit. And when you leave California, the price of gas drops significantly by over a full pound, a pound plus, right? It drops per gallon. And then the other thing that happens is the presence of Teslas drops, and like it's the same kind of thing. Just like you get to Arizona, and once you leave Arizona, you might see some there, but New Mexico, boom, it goes straight down, and just that's going across that southern strip of the nation, to where like you're just not going to see them. On the other hand, if you live in Texas, in certain parts of Texas, especially, it's such a big place. Texas is as big as France, right?
Yeah,
and a lot of it, you are your own provisioning element. So you do need an extra fuel tank. You do need a pickup truck, because everything you do involves you being your own logistics company for your own life for a lot of these people.
Yeah.
And as great as electric cars are, they're just not up to that challenge. You can drive for 500 miles west in Texas and not get to the end of West Texas. Like it's an enormous place that just isn't, the market isn't set up to deal with that demand,
Yeah. That's a big problem. And battery technology, as I said, takes time, but it is getting better. And there's so much money and interest being thrown at new technologies. I think we're going to see, I think for a city, it's fine, right? I think like a city like London, it's not often I get in my car and drive more than 200 plus miles, so cities, I think, is fine. But you're right, these areas where you need to drive, 400 miles, 500 miles, you're going to need a better battery for that.
Yeah, and then we lose sight of this, the reality that this person who lives here geographically has different demands on a battery than the person who lives over here.
Yes.
If you live in a really cold place like Alaska, an electric car probably isn't the answer for you, because it's again, thermodynamics gets in the way, right? And it's harder to hold energy in something that's that survives at negative 20 degrees Celsius or something.
Yeah.
But we don't seem to tolerate that here in the U.S. We seem to want it to be like this universal solution, and that you just have to suck it up and do it. But the reality is it's just not reality.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because they're talking now. Investing in charging infrastructure is really key, right? Even more so than tax credits or whatever. Because if you're confident about charging, you need to stop and take a rest, right? After I don't know, a couple of hours driving, right? If you're confident about charging, that changes the picture quite a lot, right? Because you feel okay, I'm going to stop anyway. If I can charge, then what's the problem, right? By the time you've got a cup of coffee, gone to the toilet, you can be charged up. So we need governments to invest in charging infrastructure. It's probably one of the best things they can do.
One of the things that we lose sight of is how far we've come in the automobile industry. I've been fascinated for kind of the last year and a half or so with a lady named Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was a fairy girl, right? And she, in 1895-ish, she rode in a covered wagon from her home in, South Dakota to Missouri. Like, that's how she moved, right? And this is 1895. It really isn't that long ago. But the other thing about this is then the next era, like in terms of highways and getting around here, at least in the United States, it was slow moving. It was town to town, red light, stoplight, go, and like cars. Like, I get my brother's Camaro is a 71 Camaro. It is a beautiful car. But if you go 100 miles an hour in that thing, you're going fast. The hood starts to fly and everything.
Yeah.
So we used to go a lot slower. You go 100 miles an hour now in any car, you're like, yeah, I'm going 100 miles an hour. It's fast, but the car feels safe, right? And so we used to go a lot slower. And so this idea of driving somewhere with the purpose of, hey, I'm going to stop for a couple hours, take a break, see some things, and move on to the next thing. We really can wrap our heads around it. But again, that's not for everybody. Some people are like, I need to go from here to there, 8 hours. My gas car can do it. That's how I'm going to do
it. Yeah. No, that's very right. We've become, quite demanding, I guess. And people hate the idea of you've got the early adopters, right? Who are like, okay, I'll put up with a set amount of pain because I want an electric vehicle, but we need mass market, right? So we need people who charging needs to be easy. They can't be bothered to figure out, some complicated system, right? So, yeah. But
one of the problems is the extraction of the assets. So, at least in America, we've become extremely consumer focused, even with our vehicles. Like, I've got a 2014 Ram truck, cylinder engine, very simple, doesn't use a lot of gas. And if I just drive that thing for the next 20 years, I'm going to outperform anybody who buys 5 EVs in that time. There's just no way around it. The energy it takes to make my little car run versus using up a car, destroying it, and everything else. That's a tough problem for us to solve, because you really should own these things for a much longer time. It takes a lot of energy to bend and shape things and all those things.
Yeah, no, it is a problem. I mean, the good news is, once you've got electric vehicle battery made, once you've used all the energy and whatever to make electric vehicle battery, they do last, they do last a long time, actually, they're finding. So, and electric vehicles use energy more efficiently, right? So if you talk about, the gasoline you burn to get motion, there's a lot of loss there, right? So we're gaining through efficiency with batteries. That's important too.
The other challenges, and you talk about this in the book again with extraction, is political influence, the power exchange between humans and entities and everything, but also the human cost of getting these things out and what it means to live downstream from this lithium lake or whatever it's going to be. Can you talk about some of those challenges?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The point of my book is to talk about these challenges, and I think a lot of people don't realize, which is that moving to clean energy, to electric vehicles, we're going to need a lot of raw materials, and it means a lot of mining. And I think mining has to be up there with the least sexiest industry out there, right? No one says, I want to work in mining. No one says, this is a great green, sexy industry. No one wants to live near a mine, right? And this is part of the problem, is that we need mining to make this transition, to make a better world to reduce climate change, yet no one wants to live near a mine. And not, for years, not particularly talented people wanted to work in mining, right? So we got this fascinating sort of conundrum. And also the minerals are found where they found, right? Geologically, you have countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo is going to provide, most of the cobalt we need for the electric vehicles. Indonesia is going to provide most of the nickel. Lithium is going to come from Australia and Argentina and Chile. So you got all these countries, they all have their different politics. And at the same time, you have this fault line of China-US struggle, or the soft Cold War, or whatever it's being called these days, right? So in each of these countries has to think, well, I'm trying to hedge myself between the West and China, right? I don't want to be completely taken over by China, and they're trying to hedge themselves. So you've got all these different sort of geopolitical and political influences, and then you have the environmental impacts. Indonesia is a country, it's one of the biggest coal exporters, and it coal's like 60% of its electricity grid. So you're digging up nickel, you're processing nickel using coal-fired power. This is also an area known for its its beauty and biological variation, since Darwin's time. So you've got all these impacts going on, geopolitical, environmental. So it's about managing those. And the point of my book is to say, let's open our eyes, let's see what's going on, so that we can make it better. But let's be aware of the challenges. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and here it is. It's called Volt Rush: The Winners and Losers in Race to Go Green.
Yeah, thank you. So some of the losers, when I went to DRC, it's a poor country, mining cobalt in this area of the DRC, which is rich in copper and cobalt. It's just below the surface. They're geologically blessed. It's just near the surface. You can dig up the cobalt and copper. So there's not many jobs there, so of course people just go out and dig up cobalt, often children involved. It's a pretty tough situation, and electric cars, price goes up, demand goes up, more people go out and mine for this stuff, right? So this is all these challenges going on.
It's such a big part of the challenge. And even to illustrate that, within your book, you talk about how you name the Democratic Republic of Congo, because that's such a conflicted place politically, internally, that you have to here's what we're going to call this country, because it's been called several things in the recent past, and it'll probably be called several things in the near future. But that's how hard. And here's this prime, exporter of cobalt, and they can't even get along internally enough to survive a long-term government.
I mean, it's fascinating, because you go there and the cobalt's just, it's landlocked where the cobalt's mined, and it's just trucked out of the country, and the trucks have to go across, two African countries to get to the coast, when it's exported. So you've got this huge concentration and supply chain risk, right? This is like the nightmare of supply chains, right? You're not diversified at all, right? You've got one country providing all the cobalt, and it's not even logistically secure, right? It's trucks going out of the border, crossing the continent to the coast, right? And then even worse, it goes to China to be processed. So you got this incredibly complicated supply chain. Well, not complicated, but problematic, I guess.
And then wherever you have these kind of resource calls or extractions, it's very challenging to be what I guess we would consider humane and ethical, right? Yeah. Having a bunch of kids filling their bucket full of sand and cobalt, probably not the thing that we want. And then you see these horrible images of folks who have a lot of needs in China, with no protective gear, melting down the metals from our used phones. And you're like, oh, what kind of an asshole am I? I mean, all this stuff happens, and you're like, but I don't want to spend $1,000 on a phone. I certainly don't want to spend $10,000. Yeah, it's like, how do you stay competitive in the market if not by exploiting someone?
I think we've just had this huge blindness in the West, total blindness to what's going on in our supply chains. And for so long, you talk about our smartphones. You're exactly right. Like all these materials, why are they cheap, right? It's because they're all processed, as you say, in Chinese factories, or dug up in the Congo. And I think we've just ignored what's going on. But the good thing about an electric vehicle is we can't ignore it any longer, because people are like, well, this is a clean product, right? This is a green product. You know, the CEO of an automaker company will have a nightmare being like, I don't want to be accused of child labor tomorrow, right? So they have an incentive to clean up the supply chain in a way that I think wasn't there before. No one cared about where the smartphone came from, or where the battery in your camcorder or whatever came from. So that's a good change that I see going on.
One of the things here in America that we do is big in front of something. Big oil, big pharma, big ag, and I get it. We don't want the corporate overlords or the government overlords to take too much, but you also need the Johnsons and Johnsons of the world to invest in these small companies that are trying to medically change the world, or, GE, or even, heaven forbid, Shell or Chevron or BP invest in energy companies, right? As they try to figure out, because they want to have the market, they want to figure out where these things are at.
Yeah, we need that. That's exactly. Otherwise, if Western companies withdraw, you get state-owned oil companies or state-owned mining companies where there's no transparency, right? And there's no, very well. It's harder to hold them to account. I think you're right.
Yeah. And so you get things like conflict diamonds and other, any of the heavy earth minerals. I mean, these things are going to be extracted in a way that you have to have enormous investments to get it from where it's extracted to where it needs to be.
Yeah, and I think a big problem has been that big Western companies are afraid to go into the Congo, or afraid to go into Indonesia, because there are a lot of problems. But it's also because they've been punished by investors or others who can't, who don't want to take the risks, right? And I think this is the problem, that we'd rather these big companies do this than shady Chinese companies or smaller companies, right? So one downside of a lot of scrutiny or a lot of environmental pressure has been companies have just withdrawn from a lot of these countries, right? So we need to have some acceptance, in the West or the US, that mining is needed. It involves some trade-offs, right? We've got to be comfortable with some sort of trade-off. I don't really know what it looks like, but I think that's going to be very hard.
Yeah, no, for sure. The environmentalist in me hates the thought of having to have more mining, but the reality is that energy has to come from somewhere, and if it's not going to get drilled into the ground where there's oil and sucked out and shot somewhere else, we're going to have to scratch down mountains and dig up beautiful places to have, because we don't ever crave less energy. This is the conundrum, right? We want more and more and more, for faster, for cheaper, for longer. It's not a sustainable thing where you also get to have a planet that's not scratched apart by mines. Yeah,
but I think we got to keep things in perspective, in that if we're moving away from fossil fuels, we will need mining, but we won't need so much coal mining, for instance, right? And we won't need so much oil, hopefully. So, there are challenges with this new supply chain, but overall it should be better, because you're getting rid of some of the impacts of fossil fuels. So we got to keep that in mind as well.
One of the other conundrums, talk about this a little bit too, the enormous size of China and the demands that it takes to run, to keep, everybody thinks like China is perfect in their execution of strategy and everything else. They're not. They have a lot of demands internally on their government, where their middle class is bigger than your population and our population combined and times something, right? So they want cars, they want air conditioning, they want video games, they want these things that all require an enormous amount of energy. And by the way, just down the road from them, India, same thing, right? So we're talking billions of people that are going to be coming up over the next 50 years into a level of much more affluence. And if we don't allow China and India to stabilize and keep stable their country, oh gosh, you want to spend carbon, start a war, because there's not enough stuff for everybody.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. China's, we tend to think of them as brilliant, like strategists or whatever, but they've got a huge amount of internal problems. Huge. If you think about Xi Jinping's constituency, the middle class is it, right? You're exactly right. They want all these things. They don't want pollution anymore. And the problem is, like, a lot of as we talked about earlier, a lot of the business in China was polluting, is polluting. So they have to clean up their own environment. They're going to be victims of climate change. They have to satisfy the middle class. They have to create jobs, for the middle class. It's a huge problem. But electric vehicles fit into what the Communist Party wants, right? It satisfies the middle class demand for product, right? And keeps air pollution low, right? Because when I lived in China, air pollution was going to cause social unrest, right? It was causing social unrest. It was nuts. And rich people didn't like it. Middle class people didn't like it. So you have electric cars, you clean up air pollution. You also generate jobs through, you're building your own companies, and you generate the economy, because China feels it can be a leader in electric vehicles in a way that it can never catch up with gasoline vehicles. Germany had decades of head start, right? US had decades of head start, right? China was closed when all the car culture of the US and Europe was taking hold. So EVs satisfy a lot of their priorities. So I think that's why they're so keen on it.
And what happens? This is just speculative, but let's play with the concept. What happens if the current power structure in China is overthrown for something else? I mean, we want China to be this long-term. We have a 100-year strategy. Yeah, you do, until you get punched in the mouth. Like, all of a sudden, everything changes. What happens then when China's like, forget all this crap? We're just going to burn coal, burn oil, or whatever it is, right? Whatever way they figure out they have to survive to maintain stability.
I think stability is key for them, right? They always talk about stability, and I think we've seen that when they've had power shortages or power issues, they go back to coal mining or whatever, and that's because they don't want to tolerate any sort of disruption, any social instability, any threat to the transition. They want to do the transition. They're investing heavily in renewables, more than any other country, right? Heavily in electric vehicles, but they will not tolerate any messiness in this transition, any disruption that's going to lead to lights out or or things like that, or or problems. But saying that, they have had problems, and they people have been predicting the fall of the Communist Party for a long time. So I won't enter that game, but they have had problems, and they do seem to deal remarkably well with a lot of issues. So yeah, let's see.
In California here, a news story, it was national.
Yeah.
Our desire to do great things, to lead the way in California here. And so we're like, we're not going to sell any more gasoline cars in 2035. And by the way, we're having a strain on our electrical grid, so everybody try to not use. But so you have these things, right, where we look like absolute fools, right? And so California, yes, right, that's a problem here, but also now scale that to China, where, I mean, it's an incredibly challenging problem to get right, especially like you're tying both hands behind your back to say we're not going to burn, this stuff that just. There's a fire in West Virginia underground in a coal mine that they cannot put out because there's so much energy. You can't defeat it.
Yeah, interesting. No, you're right. China faces so many challenges. It's not a easy country to govern, right? And you're exactly right. We've seen, like, in Southwest China, they have loads of hydropower, right? 60% or whatever, 80% comes from hydropower. Then they've had this drought, so the hydropower is not working. So it causes electricity shortages, which, people can't charge their electric cars. You're exactly right. So they're big victims of climate change. So they're kind of in a tough situation. They need coal, to keep the lights on, but they're going to suffer from climate change as well. So it's a tricky one. And this is what we're going to see, is that the impacts on the supply chain are just going to be multiplied going forward, right? It's going to be droughts, heat waves, etc. So we in the West need to get building our own supply chain, because we need to diversify, because not only geopolitically, but just the climate impacts are going to be big.
Yeah, it's the climate thing, right? That's the so we have the environmentalist faction, which is different than the climate faction, because those things don't always overlap. So, like, one of the things we have here in California, we have a thing called the water war, and we have the ag fight, we have the farmer fight, or actually the ag fight, the conservationist fight, the population center fight. Like, all these people want to deal with water. And we're like, hey, we're going to raise the level of our dams. We can't do it. We end up in court, and so we end up with no solution and just more fighting and tension, right? And again, this goes out to the world now. Like, you're trying to, how do you reliably and ethically?
Precisely.
Yeah, it's just such a mess. What are some of the things that you saw as you look through this entire system that you're like, I don't know how they're ever going to solve this part of the problem?
Well, I mean, something like graphite, is we need graphite as a form of carbon, right? We need it for our electric vehicle batteries, but China produces like over 90%, of this graphite, and that's a huge challenge for the West, because it's not particularly high value material. Proportion of costs in your EV, it's not a huge proportion, but it's just so dominated by China. And also the production in China is, I didn't really go into it in my book, but I wish I had. It's just incredibly polluting. They have natural graphite mines, which are like which are like something out of the Congo, but in China. Then you have artificial graphite, synthetic graphite, which you require huge amounts of energy from coal-fired power to produce. So it's just a nightmare. It's really polluting. It's dominated by China. I mean, for the West, what's the upside? It's like, you're gonna have to buy it from China, and it's hugely polluting. It's I think it's a huge problem, and it probably doesn't get enough attention, I don't think, at the moment. So that's something I thought, I think is hugely problematic. Nickel's the same, like Indonesia, as I talked about, like most of the growth in nickel is going to come from Indonesia, but again, it's dominated by Chinese companies. It's polluting, it's carbon intensive. We need solutions, but we need them to happen now. It needs to happen now. So there are all these problems that I think will be ironed out, but they're quite problematic at the moment.
Think about history and things like Japan and China's, they're relatively peaceful now, but that's not the history, right? Like, they've always fought, and when Japan, they got to a war with everybody who lived around them,
Obviously.
And that's the sort of thing. There's another conundrum too that I'm curious in your thoughts on. As we become more connected in a global marketplace, there's a number, and you can choose to believe this or not, anybody else, but the top 15 cargo ships pollute more than all of the cars. And it's just like this problem where you're like, we need things to come from places where it's less expensive to deliver them. And, we do want to find efficiency, but boy, oh boy, like when you think about that, you're like, and I'm the jerk. Like, I'm like, what are we going to do about these ships and these other problems that come up? And you realize, man, how are we ever going to make a dent in this thing?
Yeah, no, that's hugely problematic as well. Shipping needs to be decarbonized, and I think batteries can do it for sort of short term shipping, but for longer term shipping, we're going to need some other solutions, because you're right. It's used dirty fuels, right? For too long, right? And it's been a law unto itself, right? The high seas, the ocean. Shipping sector, so I think it produces like 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions. So it's not everything, but that's quite substantial, So that needs to decarbonize as well.
This isn't something where you can use wind. I mean, it would take so many ships. The amount of ships it would take to move the cargo that we move now would be just as horrible in terms of an impact on carbon and everything else. One of the problems that we're dealing with is methane. Did that come up at all in your book in terms of how you looked at all this problem? Because methane is much more.
No, but I agree that is a massive problem. It's not something that comes up in my book, but I agree that that's an absolutely huge problem. And yeah, I think that's a separate topic, but it didn't come up in my book, unfortunately. But yeah, I'd love to explore it next time.
Yeah, and just for the audience, it's like these weird things where like we build these reservoirs and they off gas methane, which is a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's a problem. But let's not talk about that right now. Let's talk about part of the story of the book. And if I say, hey, who's the big voice of electric vehicles? It's Elon Musk, right? Like you literally can't name anybody else who's in any way influential.
Precisely.
And he whatever you think of Elon Musk, he definitely picks some interesting things to poke at and to mess with as he tries to redefine a lot of our future survival.
Yeah, but I think you can criticize what he says on Twitter or whatever, or this and that. But I think one thing he's understood just incredibly clearly is scale, which I just think is very impressive. He's real, he realized early on, and he still realizes like the need for scale being important, and producing batteries at scale, producing electric vehicles at scale, setting up these gigafactories. Everything's about scale because you need to bring the costs down. We need electric vehicles to be cheaper. That's the number one thing, right? People need to be able to afford these vehicles. So he's appreciated scale. He's been one of the quickest and earliest to set up big battery factories, to set up partnerships with battery producers, to have a vision of the scale of electric vehicles. And I think I really, admire that. I think it's very impressive. And he's prodded all the other automakers into action, right? Like VW and all these German automakers. And even in China, China is a incredibly difficult market for foreign companies, for a whole variety of reasons. And maybe it won't work out for Tesla, I don't know. But they're doing well in China, and that's an achievement also. And to do well amongst consumers, it ain't easy, especially in electric vehicles. They've got a lot of fierce competition in China, and they do well. So I think I admire the way Tesla has pushed the industry forward and realized about batteries and the supply chain. If you look at all the automakers, Tesla's one of the ones that's signed lithium deals and cobalt, etc., more than the others. So they realized early on that we got to reduce these batteries at scale. We got to mine these minerals. We got to get some insight into supply chain, some sort of control over it. So I think they're in a good position. You see the automakers always following them, I have to say, than the other way around. But I think for the US market, it's interesting. I think the electric pickup truck. Perhaps they've been a bit slower on that, right? And we've seen Ford come out with the electric pickup truck, right? So that's going to be a huge market, right? You can tell me more about that, but I'm guessing that's going to be a huge market.
It's a challenge with the electric pickup market because nothing has captured the market. It's also the kind of people that own pickups, and I'm being very unfair in general, are independent. And look, I'll tell you a real honest to goodness problem with these things. As a Tesla or any kind of electric car is basically an Internet of Things tool. I mean, someone else has control of whether or not you can drive somewhere. It's all drive by wire, and nobody in Texas likes that. They want to drive their truck where they want to drive it. They don't want to be told, how fast, how slow, if now, if not. They don't like that. And so there's going to be people that are going to, fight hard. I mean, really hard to prevent those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. You raise a really interesting point because this is it could be a problem, and interestingly, it is a problem in China as well because they don't want foreign companies having so much data on their citizens. But you're right. At the same time as we're having EVs, all the EVs now seem to be computers on wheels, and I don't know why the two go together, but all the EVs seem to be over computerized, right? Have huge screens, track everything you do. You mentioned Tesla. You're right. Like your wife's driving or your family's driving, you have the app on your phone, anyone in the family, and you can see where that car is, where it's going. So there's whole sort of issues like that. And maybe there's an opportunity to decouple those things. Why can't we have EVs without massive computers on wheels, right? there's probably a consumer that just wants an electric vehicle, doesn't want, all the software, all the games, like all the tracking, etc.
Yeah. And if you give the government the chance to turn your car off because you didn't do something, they're going to. They're going to try.
And that's the fascinating thing in China. If you see some government buildings, they say no Tesla. Because their Communist Party is paranoid, but they're paranoid about data, right? And what data are they collecting? What's going on? I think that is a problem for Tesla in China.
Yeah. One of the other problems with all of that, like here in America, at least, the Democrat Party won't even say the word Tesla. Very similar to and then here's Elon Musk say, and look, maybe he's not your kind of asshole, whatever, right? But he's the one. He's like, I'm trying to get us off this planet, electrify things with batteries. Like I'm doing. Like, look at my business and how it's structured.
Yeah,
and they won't acknowledge that he exists, right? And that's how challenging these things are. Like, because he's taking power and attention away from the system, it causes the system to push back against it. And right now, it's the Democrats. Give in our country, give the Republicans 5 minutes, and they'll be against him too, if they're not already, right? So constantly fighting this battle for attention and influence. Meanwhile, he's trying to get in front of the cobalt market and, hey, whatever the next cobalt is as well.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I don't understand why they don't mention him. He's done the most for EV adoption, by far compared to Ford and GM. So I don't really understand it.
And he's driven the market, right? He's made it so that other companies have to invest in this. They can't. When you look, okay, so there's a lot of things we can talk about here, and a lot of this stuff's in the book. Let me put the book back up here. Let's call Bolt the winners and losers in the race to go green. And you guys should get that. The link is right down below. And look, buy 2 books. Read it with a friend.
Yeah, thank you. And there's probably something we should talk about. Which is when I read the book. Apart from Tesla in the US, the US seemed a bit far behind. But now, Biden's passed this Inflation Reduction Act. It's it's pretty promising. It's pretty bold and ambitious, and I think we're in an exciting period because the US is back in the game. China's obviously in the game. Europe's in the game. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It's a scramble for the raw materials and for the batteries that's needed, right? And there's going to be a real stress point, which is what's the willingness or the tolerance of Europe and the US to Chinese companies, to Chinese presence in this supply chain, because the Inflation Reduction Act is very strict. It says to get this EV tax credit, we don't want, as far as I read it, we don't want Chinese companies involved in this supply chain, right? So that's fine, but the supply chain doesn't exist in the US and the Western world to make up for China. So we got problems ahead, right? We want to decarbonize. We need to decarbonize, but we rely on China in many ways to decarbonize. Decarbonize, which is that's a problem in some respects.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and the whole, again, the geopolitical aspect of this. China, as much as we want data as a corporate entity, China wants our data too, right? They all want data. So our Department of Energy invests a lot of time in any kind of electrical, like major infrastructure electrical device that powers our electrical grid or allows it to flow. That stuff comes from China, right? And so the Department of Energy basically impounds everything that comes through and does a counterintelligence investigation upon it, to figure out like how, not if, how it's being exploited. And we start a new counterintelligence investigation about every, I don't know, something like 45 minutes against China here in the US, right? So there's a lot of, all this intrigue is all a drag on that efficiency of trying to find.
Yeah, I agree. But I think the other problem is, you can't reverse globalization in a second or overnight, right? So we've built up these massively complicated supply chains that are driven by efficiency and cost, right? And it's very hard to just suddenly say, okay, we're going to change things, right? But I do think in clean energy, it's got way too dominated by China. We need to diversify, right? Just from pure logistics and as I said earlier, like climate change impacts, just from pure logistics, we need to diversify sources of supply, and I think that's happening. And that's going to happen.
Let's use this last little bit of the show here to talk about the future. That's kind of how your book concludes too. Is you know, the final frontier, better batteries, and that kind of thing. What did you find out? We've talked about how challenging and hard and impossible this all is. Let's hear some good news.
Yeah, the good news is there's new battery technologies coming down the pipeline that they're going to improve things. And the other good news is a lot of consumers, I mean, perhaps you know, not in the US like you said, or not in Texas, but consumers even in China are going for smaller cars. We might see the same in Europe. So we could see a situation where transport changes, right? I'm not saying in Texas, but elsewhere, you know, we could get better at moving people around, choosing EVs for, you know, smaller EVs for inner city travel and bigger cars for outside the city. It's all up for grabs. You know, we've got e-bikes. We're developing a lot in Europe. So the good news is, you know, maybe we don't need to replicate the old model in certain countries. And then we've got technology improvements, right? You can have the sodium-ion batteries. You know, sodium is pretty abundant, right? It's table salt, right? It's you got these technologies that, okay, maybe they won't be the one dominant technology, but at the edges they'll ease demand. You know, they'll soften some of the impact. So we got new technologies coming down. There's a lot of attention, money, a lot of clever people in this world, right, working on this problem. So that's going to happen. So yeah, we're going to see things come down the pipeline.
What about mining? How is that evolving?
Yeah, so that's also evolving because, you know, there can be better mining, greener mining. You have electric mining trucks, things like that. You can also have, you know, there's new technologies such as in lithium. In California, they're trying it in the Salton Sea. You know, where you have geothermal power plants, and you may be able to extract lithium from the fluid that you're pumping up. So you get geothermal energy and lithium potentially at the same time, right? So these kind of things, new ways of extracting lithium, of extracting minerals, can help as well.
The car industry also is evolving. I don't know. Updates from the companies is that a lot of the company, like, it's really like put a bunch of boxcars of raw materials at the front door of the company, and then out of the other end comes this completed car. I mean, it's amazing, and there aren't that many people inside that building. It's mostly machines doing it.
Precisely, yeah, precisely. It's just machines that make the machine.
Yeah, right, exactly. Machines that made a machine, and really, you're bringing up raw materials, and maybe it's not all me. Maybe the batteries are made somewhere else or whatever it is, but possible they're doing a lot of the work in that building to sort of control that. And it's a very Fordian kind of thing where you go not only vertical with business but horizontal.
Yeah, and you're right. It goes back to the days of Henry Ford shipping in iron ore and rubber, whatever, and then producing cars the other end. And I think that's right. The auto industry is realizing that vertical integration is key because, you know, you control your supply chain, you can absorb some of the costs, right? Because if you don't control batteries, if you don't control materials, each of those companies wants a margin, right? It needs a margin, needs to make money, right? To pay their staff and whatever. So it's not so efficient.
I'm looking here at the book here. There's another chapter I wanted to cover with you. The world's greenest battery. Let's talk about that. That's chapter 14, everybody.
Oh, yeah. So this is kind of an interesting story, which obviously is still going on, but a company, Northvolt in Sweden, which built a battery factory using abundant hydropower, clean energy in Sweden. And it sort of shows some of the advantage of the West, the West that we can have, you know, by thinking differently, by thinking innovatively, some of the advantages and challenges that we face. But, you know, coming up with a battery, they want to build the greenest battery where they use clean energy, they use recycled materials. And it was a bold effort and bold attempt, but it's, you know, it seems to have done pretty well. You know, they built the factory, they're producing batteries. And what it showed was, we can compete with China, but they also got a lot of support from the European Union, from the European Investment Bank, from Goldman Sachs, from others. They raised a lot of capital, and I just think it's an interesting story because they wanted to do things differently.
Yeah, and I guess that's what the opportunity you're creating is. You have the main market, and off of that, you have these little pocket markets that exist off of this big system where you can slowly. And one of the things I've learned from having this show is you can never bet against software engineers, right? They will constantly, slowly ensnare the problem until it might become a different problem, but this problem gets dealt with, through software and just constantly encroaching upon that problem, even if it's from the fringes.
Yeah, but I also think it shows that starting from scratch in this battery business is not easy, right? You need to raise billions and billions of dollars, right? It's just not cheap. If I said I'm going to go out and build a battery factory, it's just not easy. You need to have capabilities to raise loads of capital. You need to have the engineering expertise, and then once you've got the factory, you need to produce a high efficiency, right? You don't want to waste all the batteries. You need to produce billions of cells every year. So it's a really, really tough challenge.
We had Bjorn Lomborg on the show a while back. Economic part of the problem, and he talks about the people who don't have enough wealth have to do things like burn charcoal, burn coal, whatever it is, wood. And so the example is always Haiti, where you look at a satellite image of Hispaniola, the island, and half of it is green, full of poor people. The other half is basically a desert, because they've cut down every damn tree they have because they're energy poor. And so, we try to solve these problems here in America for Haiti, and it ends up just being a fiasco because the money goes in and it goes to everything except for the problem. And all the smart people leave Haiti because they're like, I got to get the hell out of here. This place is terrible. And so we still have these places where, the suffering is going to continue, and we just don't seem to have an answer for that. What are your thoughts on solutions for that? Is it importing major batteries? How do we deal with these unsolvable? I mean, calming down Africa. I mean, pick a country, and there's probably a problem there.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's complicated, but I think we've got to have hope, right? And in a way, this whole the war over Ukraine in Europe, it's taught us the problems of relying on one country for a supply of an important commodity. That's an important lesson, right? So let's get our act together, and let's build. Let's not just keep offshoring and outsourcing, thinking someone else is going to solve the problem, right? Let's, in a lot of ways, we need a massive mobilization of resources and money to solve this problem, and we're capable of it. We just need the will, and geopolitical rivalry can prod us into action, right? So that's a good thing.
Yeah, sadly, war is a great power of invention. Drives innovation like crazy. One of the other things that we'll have to deal with at some point is just the stigma of electric vehicles. You have one. Do you like it? What are the sacrifices that you have to make?
Yeah, it's interesting. To me, not many. Apart from when you're doing a longer trip, you need to slightly plan in advance where you're going to charge. So I'm talking like 5-hour drive or something like that, 5 or 6 hour drive. You just need to be aware of where you can charge and where you can't. But in the UK, it's kind of good because you turn up at these hotels in the countryside and they often have chargers and you charge for free overnight, right? So, if that was gasoline, that's not cheap. That's not cheap right now. So it's getting better and better in Europe. It's really there aren't too many disadvantages. I can see your example about Texas. I think that's obviously an issue, but in Europe, it's really there's a lot more charging. It's getting better. I mean, there are problems. You turn up a service station and some chargers are not working, so that needs to be sorted out. The charging situation in the UK can be a bit of a wild west. There's loads of different companies operating charging stations. charging different amounts for electricity, whatever. But yeah, so all that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, and wait till we find out that if you go to this company's charger, you're funding a cartel, of evil.
Yeah.
So we're all like, oh my god, I can't afford it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, but no, there aren't too many. I think I love it. I think it's drives completely smoothly, quietly. It's pretty nice.
It's pretty nice. Yeah, the problem of solving one of our biggest problems is energy problem.
Yeah.
Crazy, it's complicated, but we seem to be doing it. Should we have hope that we're actually going to crack this nut in time to get control of carbon?
Yeah, I think we should have hope. We're as you say, we're dealing with it now. We're tackling with it, and yeah, everything you do helps, right? So it's not like we can solve all the problem tomorrow or whatever, but everything you do helps. So I think we're definitely on our way, and we've got to give a credit to China as well. Like they are doing a lot in terms of investing, and I think it's good in the US if the US sees this as like an opportunity economically, right? To have companies in this industry of the future, right? Companies means jobs, right? Means local investment, right? If we start seeing it as this opportunity rather than it's a cost, it's a tax, it's a cost, it's an opportunity, right? To have these industries of the future. I talk in my book about all these billionaires. I mean, it's just extraordinary. If you look at the wealthiest people in China, there's a list recently. A lot of them are in batteries or clean energy. I mean, the wealth that's been created in China from this transition so far is extraordinary. Billions, billionaires created. So, this is, why wouldn't the US want some of this opportunity, right? This is the US dream, right? To create wealth, to create jobs, to create pioneering companies. So I think it's good.
And it turns out when you make billionaires, especially in the energy sector, what they do is they invest in the next thing, and
Yeah.
so they have. It's not like they keep all the money and they hold it. Like no, they push it back out, and it's not the perfect system, but that is. One real quick note. I guess I'll ask you about this. We had Dr. Stephen Running, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the year.
Oh, wow.
And he's a climatologist guy. And I said, "What do we do, man? How do we figure this out?" He's like, "It's going to be some kind of blend of these natural like petroleum-based energies, and then the other stuff that we come up with. In some regions, you can ride your bike. In some regions, you can't."
Yeah, precisely.
Saying if we could get and control the carbon in the atmosphere to around 400, I think it was 400 parts per million. He's like, that's sustainable. We can do that and live within that. So he gave us a goal instead of just this hocus pocus word of, global climate change. That is insane. There's no goal in that, right? But he's like, if we can get it and hold it around 400, we can probably manage the rest. And that might mean we're going to power these batteries off of a plant that, it has run by not coal, but a cleaner form of gasoline or whatever it is, and then that power goes out and is exported out. And he would say kind of, and I don't know what words is about, but he kind of saw a hybrid future, at least for the near term.
Yeah, I think like we talked about, right? There could be different solutions for different countries, but what we need is to tackle the problem, right, at scale, right? So, do some people have to make? I don't think when people are going to have to make sacrifices too much, right? Because the technology is improving, the costs are going to come down, the batteries are going to get better. So I don't see it as a huge sacrifice. It could be cleaner energy. Could also be cheaper, right? So that's good. That's what we want. We want cheap energy. We want cheap EVs.
Yeah. And it could be own less cars in the future too. I know we have an interstate here, Interstate 5, that goes up and down the whole West Coast. And who says you have to ride in your car in that thing?
So I see.
Just hop in a car purpose built to go up and down that highway at extreme speeds. Like the train thing they were trying to build there is already obsolete. These cars can sustain 200 miles an hour, and maybe you get out in Fresno and get into another one and you rock it up like you would on a train.
Yeah, precisely. There are all these different models, and also, in China they're trying battery swapping. Just think of the upfront when you buy your car, you buy the car minus the battery, and then you lease the battery. You can reduce costs significantly like that, right? So yeah, that's helpful.
Well, everybody, look, the book is cool. I really enjoyed the survey
you.
of the overall economy. Just there's so many names and people and places I had never even thought of,
Thank
and
you.
it blew my mind. So it was really great. It's called Volt Rush, and this is Henry Sanderson's book. You guys definitely should get that.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. Anything in closing at all, or are we good?
No, that was a really thorough chat. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Awesome. Stand by for 1 sec.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.